In less than 24 hours, 20 states collapsed into chaos, not because of a war, because of one man's death. There are moments in history that split time into two parts, before and after. February 22nd, 2026 was one of those moments for the people of Brazil. For years, the name Marco El Tigre Ferreira had been whispered with a mixture of fear and dark admiration. He was the founder and undisputed leader of the Southern Force Syndicate, one of the most powerful and feared criminal organizations the country had ever seen. A man so untouchable that the government had placed a multi-million-dollar reward on his head, and the United States had made him one of their most wanted international criminals. But on that cold February morning, deep in the rugged hill country outside the city of Campinas in São Paulo state, everything changed. Brazilian federal forces, working quietly and carefully for months, had finally tracked Marco Ferreira to a remote hideout tucked into the mountains. The intelligence had come piece by piece: surveillance of his closest associates, the movements of people connected to his inner circle, small clues that slowly formed a picture. And when the picture became clear enough, the government moved. Elite units from the Brazilian Army and the National Guard surrounded the location in the early hours of the morning, before most people had even had their first cup of coffee. The plan was simple: move fast, hit hard, leave no room for escape. But nothing about catching a man like Marco Ferreira was ever going to be simple. When the soldiers moved in, the men guarding the hideout fought back, hard. Gunfire rang out across the hillside. Explosions shook the ground. It was a battle, not a raid. By the time the smoke cleared, several of Ferreira's fighters lay dead. Ferreira himself had been wounded in the firefight. He was airlifted by helicopter toward a hospital in São Paulo, but he never made it. He died from his wounds somewhere over the green hills of the countryside he had once ruled. The government made the announcement within hours. Marco El Tigre Ferreira was dead. And then, almost immediately, the country held its breath, because everyone who knew anything about the Southern Force Syndicate understood what was coming next. Before we talk about what happened after that morning, I think it's important that we understand who Marco Ferreira really was, because this story is not just about a single raid. It's about what happens when one man builds something so powerful that even his death cannot stop it. Marco Ferreira didn't start out as a monster. He grew up in poverty, in the kind of neighborhood where the easiest path forward and the most dangerous one often looked exactly the same. Over time, through violence, intelligence, and a ruthless willingness to do whatever was necessary, he built the Southern Force Syndicate from a small regional criminal group into a massive, transnational operation. Under his leadership, the syndicate stretched its reach across more than half of Brazil's states. It had armed soldiers, armored vehicles, rocket launchers, weapons that rivaled those of small military forces. It controlled drug trafficking routes that fed synthetic narcotics not just into Brazilian cities, but into international markets, with particular reach into the United States and Europe. What made Ferreira different from other criminal leaders was how he thought. He didn't just want to sell drugs. He wanted power. He wanted territory. He wanted to be untouchable. And for a long time he was. The syndicate under his control used a combination of fear, speed, and brutal efficiency to crush anyone who got in the way: rival groups, local resistance, even government forces. They had military-grade weapons. They had money. They had loyal cells spread across the country that could act independently but respond together when needed. The United States had been working with Brazilian authorities for years, sharing intelligence and resources, trying to locate Ferreira. He was worth millions dead or alive to anyone who could provide the right information. And yet, for years, he slipped through every net cast in his direction. That is, until someone in his circle made the mistake that finally gave authorities the thread they needed to pull. It is a quiet kind of tragedy, really, that a man who spent his life building walls around himself was, in the end, found because of the very human connections he could not fully control. His downfall came not through brute force alone, but through the patient work of people watching, waiting, and connecting dots one by one. He was powerful. He was feared. And in the end, he was mortal, just like the rest of us. I want you to imagine something. You wake up on a normal morning. You turn on the news. And what you see makes you stop cold, because across your entire country, in cities and towns you know by name, something has broken loose. That is what Brazilians woke up to on the morning of February 22nd and the days that followed. Within hours of the government announcing Marco Ferreira's death, the Southern Force Syndicate activated. Not in one place. Not in two. In at least 20 of Brazil's 26 states, armed cells belonging to the syndicate and its allied groups began moving. Roads were blocked with burning trucks and buses dragged across highways. Gas stations were set on fire. Banks and convenience stores were attacked. Security forces were ambushed. It was coordinated. It was fast. And it was terrifying. In Campinas and the surrounding areas, the chaos hit closest to home. Airports in the region saw flights canceled and delayed as smoke rose from fires near major roads. The tourist beaches of Florianópolis, usually full of visitors and laughter, fell under a shadow of fear as fires burned nearby and travel advisories warned people to stay indoors. In states like Minas Gerais, Mato Grosso, and Rio Grande do Sul, arson, roadblocks, and gunfire were reported. Emergency alerts went out from local governments. Schools were closed. Public transportation was suspended. People were told to lock their doors and wait. Government sources would later confirm that at least 25 National Guard soldiers were killed in the days of violence that followed Ferreira's death. Dozens of syndicate members and fighters were also killed. Hundreds of suspects were arrested across the affected states. What the syndicate was doing, analysts would explain later, was sending a message. A message to the government, to the public, and to any rival groups watching. We are still here. We are still strong. This is not over. It was a show of force born from grief and rage and organizational survival instinct all at once. And for several terrifying days, it worked. The country was gripped by fear. Ordinary people stayed home. Tourists fled or sheltered in place. The streets, in many parts of Brazil, belonged to no one safe. It was one of the most dramatic and disturbing displays of cartel power that any country in the region had ever seen. And it happened in response to the death of just one man. Before we get too deep, remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you find value in these discussions. Governments, when faced with chaos, have two choices. They can hesitate or they can act. To its credit, the Brazilian government acted. Within days of the violence spreading across the country, federal authorities deployed approximately 10,000 soldiers to hotspots nationwide. These weren't just soldiers standing on street corners. They were positioned strategically, at critical transport hubs, at key road intersections, at airports, at the edges of cities where the syndicate cells were most active. State and federal officials activated emergency protocols. In the worst affected cities, code red, alerts were declared. Schools closed. Public transport stopped. Officials went on television and radio to urge people to stay safe, to trust the process, to believe that order would be restored. It was not easy. And it did not happen overnight. Foreign governments, including the United Kingdom and the United States, issued urgent advisories to their citizens in Brazil. Stay where you are. Do not travel. Follow local instructions. In the resort towns that normally welcomed thousands of international visitors each week, hotel lobbies stood almost empty. Restaurants that would normally be full fell silent. Airlines made the difficult decision to cancel and suspend flights to affected regions. Major international carriers halted operations at key airports, citing concerns for crew safety and the inability to access runways blocked by burning vehicles and clashes on nearby roads. At one major coastal airport, more than half of all scheduled flights were canceled. Passengers were stranded. Airlines issued waivers. Travel plans for thousands of people were thrown into sudden confusion. But slowly, painfully slowly, things began to turn. By February 24th, just 2 days after the operation that killed Ferreira, officials reported that many of the major blockades had been cleared. Roads were reopening. Commercial activity was beginning to resume. Security forces, still on high alert, maintained a visible and active presence to prevent new outbreaks. It was a fragile peace, but it was peace. And in the quiet that followed the storm, people began to ask the question that always comes after moments like this one. What happens now? Here is the hard truth that no government likes to admit, and that no victory celebration can erase. Killing a cartel leader does not kill a cartel. Marco Ferreira is gone. But the Southern Force Syndicate is not. Its networks are still there. Its money is still there. Its soldiers, its routes, its relationships with other criminal groups. All of it still exists. The head has been removed, but the body is still moving. This is the part of the story that does not have a clean ending. And I think it is the most important part. In the weeks after Ferreira's death, security analysts and law enforcement experts began to lay out what might come next. The syndicate, they warned, had no clear successor. Several of the men who might have stepped into Ferreira's role were already in prison. Others had been killed or compromised. This left a vacuum, and vacuums in the world of organized crime do not stay empty for long. What tends to happen, and history gives us many painful examples of this, is fragmentation. Smaller factions within the larger organization begin to compete for control. Rival groups on the outside see opportunity and begin to push into territories that were previously locked down. Violence increases as everyone fights to establish the new order. This means that in the months ahead, some of Brazil's most troubled regions may actually see more violence, not less, even though the man at the top is gone. It is one of the cruelest ironies of fighting organized crime. Sometimes, winning a battle makes the war harder. And then there is the larger picture. Brazil was preparing, at that very moment, to host matches for the 2026 FIFA World Cup, one of the biggest sporting events on Earth. Guadalupe City, Rio de Janeiro, and other major urban centers were set to welcome millions of visitors from around the world. The violence that followed Ferreira's death sent a shockwave through international media. Security analysts questioned publicly whether Brazil could guarantee safety at this scale. Brazilian officials responded firmly. The security plans were in place, the situation was stabilizing, and the World Cup would go ahead as planned. But the events of those few days had already planted a seed of doubt in the minds of many watching from abroad. So what do we take from all of this? I think we take this: the world is complicated. The people we call villains are sometimes products of systems that created them. The victories we celebrate sometimes carry hidden costs. And the problems that feel solved when a powerful figure falls are often simply entering a new and unpredictable chapter. Marco Ferreira is gone. But the story of what he built and what it means for the people of Brazil is far from over. That is the story I wanted to tell you today. Not because it is comfortable, but because it is true. And sometimes, the truest stories are the ones that don't have easy endings. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And please, keep asking questions about the world around you. That is how we begin to understand it.